and welcome to this episode of Bookshook for the Wire. I'm Jahnavi, and we're here today to talk about this new book, Called by the Hills by Anuradha Roy. Roy is the author of 5 fiction novels, including Sleeping on Jupiter and The Atlas of Impossible Longing, and this is her first book-length non-fiction work. It's about her moving to the edge of Ranikhet with her husband, and the house, garden, and life they have built for themselves there, as well as the ecology, flora, and fauna of the surrounding areas. In addition to her words, the book is interspersed with art made by Roy herself, describing the landscape and the flowers that she is talking about. Thank you so much for joining us today, Anuradha Roy.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you.
You write that this was commissioned as a book about flowers in the Himalaya. And of course, flora plays a big role, as does your personal garden in the hills. But it's also about so much more. It's about people, animals, ecologies. So could you talk about how that expansion happened?
Well, actually, the book was a suggestion from Christopher MacLehose, who published all my fiction. And during COVID, during the lockdown, when actually we have forgotten, but we had no idea when the lockdown would end and what would happen. And there was a sense of dread and also confinement at that time. And at that time, he asked me, he said it would be a good idea to write a book about the flowers of the mountains so that people who were stuck wherever they were could sort of wander in gardens, even if they didn't have access to one. And at first, I didn't think I had any botanical knowledge and I didn't want to do the book. So that was one resistance. But when I began writing it, I did start with writing about the flowers, but I soon saw that I couldn't separate the flowers from the place they grew and the people who were around who knew about them or who helped me to grow them or from whom I stole cuttings and so on. And so, bit by bit, it became a kind of story of the place and the people where these flowers were.
Uh, in the book itself, you've talked a little bit about your process of writing fiction and how the characters come to you and live in you and talk to you, go for walks with you, much before anyone else gets to meet them. So, given that this is your first book length non-fiction, was the process of writing this very different from that?
It really was. And I have to say that when I'm writing fiction, I feel uh, at the end of it, I feel really what I say in the book, as if somebody's taken an ice cream scoop and taken everything out of me. And I'm left totally hollowed out by that process of fiction, which can go on for 2 to 3 years sometimes to finish a book. But here, everything I was writing was around me. And in fact, sometimes I had to change things I was writing as other things happened to alter my view. So the whole process to me was very interesting to even observe in myself doing it. And it was a very joyful and relaxing process for me to just sit down and look around me and write about things I could see and hear and, people I could actually meet rather than just in my head.
Yeah. Uh, Speaking of the people you meet, and there's parts of the book where I felt a sort of push and pull of rules that you were given that you knew were a good idea, as opposed to things that you wanted to do a certain way for perhaps reasons that were nostalgic or emotional. In terms of what kind of saplings to plant, do you plant things that are non-native to the region in your garden, or in terms of the bird feeders? Of course, you really want to feed all the lovely birds that come to your garden, but then you're also told you might make them dependent on human carers. Do you think the way you think about these questions has been altered by where you're living?
Definitely. I think that came, when I came to the hills, both as a visitor and then as somebody who began to live here, my ignorance was really profound. And at the same time, I had certain ideas of, this garden being a sort of cultivated and beautiful wilderness. Actually, it's not much of a garden. It's really just a pretty scrubby patch of hillside, even now. And I have three dogs and a fourth who is a puppy, and they make sure there's no garden left. So it was a constant battle uh, between the things I found and the ideas I had come with. So it did need me to really unlearn quite a lot that I thought I knew, and to pay attention to things and people I saw around me. And often, of course, you feel some sort of frustration and irritation when you are repeatedly shown up to be an idiot, but you often realize that there's good reason, because you really don't know those things. And about the birds, um, yes, there have been wildlife biologists who've told me that having bird feeders in a wilderness of this kind is not okay, and that they need to find their own food. And I completely understand and agree with that, probably. But what can you do when there's a whole flock of them every morning screeching their heads off, saying, "You're eating breakfast, where is ours?" So I'm afraid I sort of give in, and that has happened with the birds.
Uh, when you're talking about your exploration of the mountains, you describe it as intimate, in that you don't want to climb the highest peaks or travel vast distances, but the things that are immediately around you, you want to know everything about. So could you talk a little bit about how that has been?
I um, I grew up as a child of a geologist, and he used to be away from home for 6 months of the year right through our childhood, because he used to go on these very long field surveys, which used to happen with geologists in those days. And on many of these, he was allowed to take his family with him, but they had to live as he did, because these were extremely remote areas, and we lived in tents. And I think that probably my attraction to wild spaces even now comes maybe from that, which was, I was, 2 months old when I first lived in a tent. And that continued till I was about 5 or 6 years old. But what that did was to really drive out all attraction to tents out of me for good. I have never ever wanted to go on a trek and lie in a tent. I'm sure it's wonderful, but I that's not what I wanted. So my whole way of being here has really been, we are surrounded by things I don't know, the forests, the trees. Even today, I have to keep, asking people, or now asking my apps on my phone, what certain plants are and what the trees do through the year. And you keep discovering new things even when you've lived here for 20 odd years. So that has been my sense of exploration, to really get to know the place I live in and its surroundings.
And one of the really stunning things about the book is your paintings in it. And these also seem like, you know, in some ways, they're not botanical drawings exactly, but they do give that sense a little bit. Was that part of the exploration, the learning about the new things you were encountering?
I've always had the habit of drawing. When I first came here, we had these very, basic cupboards made by a village carpenter, and they were fairly wonky and not great to look at. And when this thing was painted, it just looked like a blank space. So I then began painting these cupboards, which were 6 foot high or whatever they were. With I found scenes from the forest, the leopards we saw and heard about, and the arum lilies that were growing in the garden. And my dog is on one of the cupboards. Umbrellas, scenes from our life are on these cupboards. And that continues in my little diaries, in which I keep some notes of things growing. And in the early days when making the garden, I tried really to keep an eye out for what grew when, and to make a note of those, so I would remember. So that's how these paintings began. And then I really stopped. I can't explain why. For quite a few years, I lost all link with color and paint. I was still drawing, but I and then I went on a writing residency in Italy, in Como, where there was a British artist called Sophie Herxheimer who was painting constantly. And so we began going out together, and it all came back. And then I began painting every day. And those things are what went into the book eventually. But they weren't planned together. I mean, the book and the pictures, it was not meant to be an illustrated book to begin with.
Okay. You can't tell while reading it because a lot of it seems to match so directly with what you're writing about.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. Well, some of the pictures were done later because the editor at Hachette, Abhivyakti Singh, and Marigold Atki, the editor at my British publishers, don't. They both wanted certain specific things that they could visualize and wanted to see painted. So then they would tell me, here's one that would you try?
There's several books and authors that you reference in called By the Hills. There are people who've written about the Himalayan region, like Frank Smythe. And there are people who you've met and worked with directly in your publishing house, like Bill Aitken. And then there are people who've written about gardening in very different parts of the world, like Claire Layton. Yeah. So, what was the role all of these very diverse authors played in your work? What drew you to them?
Well, some of them actually, like I talk about Mr. Durga Kala, and he actually lived on this. So he was literally 3 minutes away from me, up the hill from our house to his. And that was an incredible thing to have this, absolute walking library sitting within reach, who would tell me about writers I needed to read, about both the mountains and others like E.H. Aitken. And, he was writing a biography of Corbett, which was going on forever. And Ravi Dayal would come down every on his visits here, because Ravi Dayal would come to this is was his summer home, kind of, as well as winter. He would come several times a year armed with this typescript, and he and Mr. Kala would sit working on this typewritten giant thing. And he also wrote a biography of Frederick Wilson, Pahari Wilson. And then there was Bill Aitken, who lived in Missouri but would visit. He was a friend of Mr. Kala's. So he'd visit us, stay with us, and, they'd sit together. And then Shekhar Pathak, who is extremely renowned as a, Himalayan scholar and traveler. Mr. Kala was a friend of his, so he would come as well. So Mr. Kala was like really a magnet who drew all this Himalayan scholarship into this little corner of Ranikhet. And we, by mere physical proximity and being in the publishing world, got to spend time with them, read them, had them tell us about other things we could read. And I became more and more interested in reading books both about the Himalayas and other mountains and natural places. So I read Frank Smith's Valley of Flowers, and that's just a wonderful thing to read even now. And then the Claire Layton you mentioned had beautiful etchings made by her. So, and it was a kind of a story of how they made their garden. So it became almost like a model for me, as were Jim Corbett's My India, and I read Verrier Elwin's Leaves from the Jungle. So all these books, which before coming here I'd really not read at all, became a great source of knowledge and happiness for me to read.
the, Towards the end of the book, it feels a little bit like it's both a mourning and a warning, that the way things have changed and are continuing to change, the rapid construction, the so-called infrastructure development, and all of that is having very profound impacts on the area you live in and also the broader region. With the increased leopard attacks that you've mentioned, the landslides, and all of that. How much have things changed just in the last 25 years that you've been there?
I would say that it's, I mean, yeah, towards the end, I know that there is a sense of almost foreboding and grief, because, uh, I mean, one of the one of the strings that runs through the book is the dogs.
Yeah.
We really happened just by pure chance to see a dog in the dilapidated thing, little hut that became our home. There was a dog when we first walked into it, and it felt as if not that specific dogs, but his mates would kind of follow. And we had them right from the start. Biscuit was the first, and then we always wandered with them in the forest. They always ran free. And that was one of the joys of having dogs in the mountains, that they ran free, they rushed after deer, they vanished out of sight, and they always came back. But post COVID and later, we began to notice a real change in the way wildlife was now coming closer and closer, becoming far more unafraid, becoming, able to hide in the bushes in broad daylight. And they are desperate and hungry. They are probably, I don't know what set of complex factors have driven their behavior patterns and habitation to change in this way, that they have been videotaped wandering the corridors of Ranikhet's civil hospital inside. And now that there are so many people who have CCTV, our neighbors have taped them hunting for chicken at 4 in the afternoon with everybody sitting outside. So, this is very bizarre behavior for wild leopards. It makes me feel quite frightened for what is happening to them, what we have done to them, and in turn, what we have created, which is coming back to now become a real threat to us. Because it hasn't happened in Ranikhet yet, but in all the outlying villages and so on, in many of them, children particularly have been killed by leopards who have come into homes, who have grabbed them from, when they were playing in a group and so on. So I think those things are a huge cause for alarm, as is the way climate change is affecting all the glaciers, so that there are incredible disasters with huge human tolls in at high altitudes, which are not really talked about all that much as they should be. Had they happened in if in a place like Delhi 220 odd people were killed in one flash flood, imagine how much people would talk about it. But when it happens up in the mountains, it's comes out in the news for a day or two and then it's forgotten. But the consequences apply to everybody, I think. So that's where the foreboding comes from.
Do you think the less attention to it is because people feel like it's a natural event that is out of their hands?
I think it's a sort of people are perfectly aware that that construction that is on a vast scale, mining, that all these things contribute to making their surroundings very unstable. Particularly people who live in places like Joshimath, where they've actually had to go away from their own homes and take shelter elsewhere. And uh, there's a particularly striking instance, like in yesterday's Supreme Court judgment about mining in Bageshwar, which the High Court in Uttarakhand had forbidden, but the Supreme Court has now allowed it again. So, while you will find that people in the villages and small towns often blame destiny for their misfortunes, such as losing relatives in a flash flood or an avalanche or a landslide, I think they are. It's a combination of being in the grips of things that are too big for you on the divine level as well as the human level, and that they are sort of being crushed between these two things.
Thank you. Those are the questions I had about the book. But just as a last question, I wanted to ask: is there something that you've read recently that has stayed with you that you'd like to share with us?
Oh, I've been reading very an odd set of books actually, which mostly they're in Bengali. I've actually been reading the autobiography of Ramsundari Devi. in Bengali, and she was a village woman and a semi-orph. I mean, she had lost her father in her childhood. She was completely illiterate because in those days, girls were not allowed to study. It was thought to be uh, the superstition was that if girls were taught to read and write, their husbands would die whenever they did get those husbands. So she was forbidden, and she knew she would be, but she had this incredible, intense desire to just read. And when she writes in her autobiography about everything she had to do to just teach herself to read from her son's books in those days, palm manuscripts. I've been finding that an incredibly inspiring book to read, and also wonderful. She is very, very good storyteller, very colorful in the way she paints, describes her surroundings and so on.
Yeah, that does sound very exciting. Thank you so much for that and for taking the time to speak to us today.
Oh, thank you, Jahnavi. It's been a pleasure.